What you are about to hear is the story of a rugged cowboy and a refined woman who defy the rules of the Wild West for a love as fierce as the frontier itself. Together, they'll face danger, betrayal, and the ultimate test of loyalty. The dusty Wild West town of Silver Creek buzzed with anticipation as evening settled over the saloon. Rough men, hardened by the frontier's harshness, sat hunched over tables, their hats tipped low, their eyes narrowed as they assessed every newcomer with suspicion. Lanterns cast flickering shadows across the room, illuminating the smoke-filled air and the worn wooden floors marked by years of scuffles and spills. Among the crowd, a man sat quietly by the bar, a cowboy of few words, his face weathered and marked by the grit of the unforgiving land. His name was Jack Ryder, known to locals as a man you wouldn't want to cross. Into this world of sweat and smoke stepped a figure out of place. Eliza Monroe, a wealthy young woman from back east, walked in with an elegance that seemed almost foreign against the backdrop of dust and chaos. She was supposed to be traveling westward to meet her fiancé, a wealthy railroad tycoon, but curiosity had led her astray. With her refined attire, porcelain skin, and delicate features, she might as well have been from another world. Heads turned as she crossed the threshold, her gloved hand holding onto the small, beaded purse at her side, her eyes wide with a mix of wonder and trepidation. Jack noticed her instantly. She didn't belong here, and every man in the saloon knew it. Her gaze swept across the room, her eyes catching his. For a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. There was something about her, something that softened the years of toughness carved into his heart. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to her, like a moth to a flame. She approached the bar, ignoring the curious looks and whispers, and ordered a drink, her voice soft yet sure. Unable to resist, Jack found himself moving closer, his boots heavy on the floor as he approached. "You're not from around here," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. She looked at him, a small, amused smile touching her lips. "What gave me away?" She replied, her accent polished, each word measured. He chuckled, surprising himself. "You don't exactly blend in." Their conversation flowed naturally, an odd sense of comfort enveloping them despite the stark differences between their worlds. She spoke of life back east, the balls, the dances, the etiquette, and he listened, more captivated than he'd like to admit. In turn, he told her of life on the frontier, of the long days spent under the scorching sun, of cattle drives and standoffs with outlaws. The walls between them seemed to crumble with every word they exchanged, the distance between them shrinking. But as the night wore on, shadows of his past began to creep into Jack's mind. He wasn't a man who made friends easily, and he certainly wasn't the kind to get tangled up with a lady like her. He had secrets buried in these lands, a reputation that kept most folks at arm's length. And she had a life waiting for her back east, a man who could offer her wealth and security, things he'd never be able to give her. Still, their connection was undeniable, like a flame in the dark, burning fiercely, defying logic. As the saloon doors swung open and a group of rowdy men stumbled in, Jack's gaze hardened. He knew some of them then. He'd had run-ins with in the past. They eyed Eliza with a dangerous glint, their smiles sharp, predatory. Jack's instincts kicked in. He moved closer to her, shielding her from their stares. One of the men, a sneering outlaw with a scar down his cheek, sauntered over, tipping his hat mockingly. "What's a pretty thing like you doing in a place like this?" He drawled, his eyes lingering a bit too long. Eliza, sensing the tension, glanced at Jack. Without a word, he stepped between her and the outlaw. "She's with me," he said, his voice cold, the hint of a threat clear. The outlaw raised an eyebrow, glancing between Jack and Eliza with a smirk. "Didn't peg you for the gallant type, Ryder," he sneered. But Jack didn't back down, his hand drifting subtly toward the revolver at his hip. After a tense silence, the outlaw backed off, muttering under his breath as he returned to his group. Eliza's heart pounded as she looked at Jack, her mind racing. The encounter had shaken her, but she was also struck by the lengths Jack had gone to protect her. In that moment, she felt a strange, exhilarating thrill, a sense of safety mixed with danger. She realized she was in far deeper than she had intended, entangled with a man who, despite his rugged exterior, had shown her a tenderness she hadn't known she craved. As the night deepened and the saloon emptied, Jack walked her back to her lodgings, the silence between them charged with unspoken words. He stopped at her door, his hand lingering at his side, his gaze intense. "You're leaving tomorrow, right?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded, feeling a pang of sadness she couldn't quite explain. "Yes, but—" She trailed off, unsure of what she wanted to say. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Then good night, Miss Monroe." But as he turned to leave, she reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. "Jack," she whispered. He stopped, looking back at her, his eyes shadowed with something she couldn't name. She wanted to say something, to ask him to stay, but she knew she couldn't. The world they came from would never allow it. The next day, Eliza boarded the stagecoach bound for the neighboring town, her heart heavy as she looked back at Silver Creek, the dust swirling around the wheels of the carriage. She hadn't been able to shake the memory of her night with Jack, the way his rough hands had shielded her, the way his eyes had softened in those stolen moments. But she reminded herself of the life that awaited her, a life of luxury, security, and expectation. She was meant to marry a man who could give her stability, not a rogue who lived life by the edge of his revolver. But as the landscape unfolded outside the carriage window, a feeling gnawed at her, an ache that wouldn't go away. Every mile she traveled felt like it was pulling her farther from something she couldn't live without. Before she could stop herself, she signaled the driver to halt, her decision made in a heartbeat. She climbed out, dusted herself off, and began walking back to Silver Creek, her resolve building with each step. She was done pretending to fit into a life that didn't feel like her own. Back in town, Jack's life had continued in the steady rhythm he knew best. The heat of the sun bore down as he worked at the stable, his mind wandering back to the night before. He cursed himself for allowing her to get under his skin, for letting himself feel something he thought he'd long buried. He tried to push it all away, but the image of Eliza's face lingered in his mind, haunting him with every passing moment. He told himself he'd never see her again, that their worlds were too different. But deep down, he couldn't help the tiny spark of hope that she might come back. When she appeared at the edge of town, dusty and disheveled but with fire in her eyes, Jack was the first to spot her. His heart skipped a beat, and he crossed the street to meet her, disbelief etched into his face. "You came back," he said, voice low, unable to keep the astonishment from his tone. Eliza gave him a faint smile, her voice strong and steady. "I couldn't go through with it," she admitted. "I don't belong in that world." "Not anymore." She took a step closer, the space between them shrinking. "I belong here. With you." Jack searched her face, every instinct telling him to turn her away, to protect her from the inevitable danger that came with staying by his side. But he couldn't deny the truth. The pull he felt was undeniable, and in that moment, he knew he could never let her go. "Then stay," he murmured, his hand brushing hers as he reached out, pulling her close. Their reunion did not go unnoticed, however. Word spread quickly through the town and soon reached the ears of Eliza's former fiancé, who had come to Silver Creek himself to retrieve her. He wasn't about to let his future bride slip away into the arms of a lowly cowboy. Enraged, he gathered a posse and stormed through town, determined to make an example of the man who dared steal from him. As evening fell, the saloon turned into a powder keg, the tension thick as the townsfolk whispered of the impending confrontation. Jack's hand rested on his revolver as he stood beside Eliza, his gaze hard as he prepared for what was coming. Eliza clung to his arm, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. She knew the man she loved was about to face a danger he might not survive, but she refused to leave his side. When her fiancé finally burst through the saloon doors, flanked by armed men, he called Jack out, his voice filled with scorn. "You think you can take what's mine?" He sneered. "A man like you doesn't deserve her." Jack stepped forward, his stance steady, his voice calm. "Eliza isn't yours. She's free to choose who she wants, and she's chosen me." The tension exploded as a gunshot rang out, and chaos filled the saloon. Jack fought with a ferocity fueled by love and desperation, fending off attackers while Eliza ducked for cover. The scene was a blur of fists, broken bottles, and gunfire, the saloon filling with smoke and dust as the fight raged on. As the smoke settled, the saloon lay in disarray, shattered bottles, splintered tables, and the echoes of the fight still lingering in the air. Jack, breathless and battered, stood at the center of it all, his revolver gripped tightly in his hand. Around him, the men hired by Eliza's former fiancé lay defeated, either groaning in pain or scrambling to escape the wrath of the cowboy who had refused to back down. But amidst the wreckage, Jack's focus was on Eliza. She rushed to him, her face pale with worry as she scanned him for injuries. "Jack," she whispered, her hands trembling as she touched his face, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her fingertips. He placed his hand over hers, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles as he reassured her. "I'm all right," he murmured, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Their brief moment of relief shattered as Eliza's former fiancé, who had managed to survive the fight, staggered to his feet. Rage and humiliation twisted his features as he raised his gun, aiming directly at Jack. Eliza, driven by instinct, stepped between them, her gaze fierce as she stared down the man who had once promised her a life of wealth and security. "This ends here," she declared, her voice unwavering. "You have no claim over me." In that charged silence, the weight of her words hit him, and the realization of his defeat settled in. Unable to accept it, he lowered his gun, his eyes filled with bitter resentment before he stormed out of the saloon, leaving them behind. His threat was gone, but the tension remained, the crowd murmuring in disbelief at the audacity of what they had just witnessed. Jack looked at Eliza, his heart swelling with a fierce pride and a love that he could no longer deny. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. She shook her head, her eyes shining as she replied, "I had to. For us." Together, they left the saloon and stepped out into the quiet of the evening. The air was filled with the scent of dust and desert, and the world around them felt strangely still, as though holding its breath in reverence of what they had just overcome. Standing under the vast, star-filled sky, Jack took Eliza's hands in his gaze searching hers. "If you stay, you're choosing a hard life. A dangerous one," he warned, his voice a gentle whisper in the night. She smiled, her fingers tightening around his. "I don't care. This is where I belong. With you." They shared a long, passionate kiss, a promise sealed under the watchful gaze of the stars.